In the book Good to Great, Jim Collins describes the path to greatness for any business as focusing solely on what you can potentially do better than any other organization. And he poses this question: what can you be the best in the world at? Well, I recently had the privilege of meeting a dairyman who has identified and pursued producing quality milk at an elite level as his unique advantage. And you're about to find out what he believes are the most impactful factors for consistently maintaining milk quality with an average somatic cell count that has stayed under 75,000 for going on 15 years between two dairies milking a total of 9,000 cows. And you're going to hear it all right here on the Up-Level Dairy Podcast. This is the podcast for dairy farm owners, managers, and advisors who are committed to profitability, sustainability, and excellence. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen, and it's my mission to bring you the conversations that will up-level your skill set and your mindset so you can be a top performer in the dairy farming business. I'm joined today by Hans Nederend III from Nederend Dairies in Marsing, Idaho. Hans took over day-to-day operations in 2007 and expanded the dairies to now run 4,000 cows through a double 40 parallel parlor on one site and 5,000 cows through a double 50 parallel parlor on the other. I connected with Hans earlier this year while facilitating a panel at the National Mastitis Council annual meeting, and his way of thinking when it comes to daily management, performance-based pay, and motivating people led to a few mic drop moments that I believe will also challenge your own thinking when it comes to understanding what it really takes to be an elite producer of quality milk. This episode is sponsored by Adisseo. Adisseo is a global leader in nutritional solutions and premier provider of rumen-protected methionine for dairy producers who want to optimize milk production, capture more value from components, and maintain the health of their high-performing herds. What I really want to get into, Hans, is when you were on this panel at the National Mastitis Council annual meeting, there were a few key questions that we brought up. And one of the first ones was really looking at milk quality and the key factors that contribute to being 75,000 somatic cell count on 9,000 cows. So what do you believe are the key factors that contribute to being able to achieve that level of milk quality?
So I think the key factor to milk quality is management. There has not been a lot of new groundbreaking ideas as of the last 10 years or so on how to milk cows. I mean, articles that are written always say the same thing, just put in different ways of explaining it. The hardest part is making sure and arousing in the employees the want to do their job correctly. That in itself is the number one hardest thing to do. There are a lot of great strategies for making a dairy successful as far as milk quality, and a lot of dairies have implemented these strategies, but many of them have failed to keep the consistency going past the implementation period. The one thing, in my opinion, that separates the dairies from the great dairies is perseverance. I'm comfortable sharing my quote secrets or whatever and how to achieve milk quality. I mean, most people can read them in magazines, whatever. I mean, not all, but most of my peers cannot or will not do the monotonous. What I mean by that is I'm constantly watching the milkers and being in the par with them, constantly letting them know that the routine has changed a bit and we need to get back on track, constantly encouraging them and trying to instill in them the desire to care as I do. This is an everyday thing. It's not rocket science, but it is boring and it can wear you down really fast. It's like watching the same episode of your favorite TV show for 17 years. It can get boring really fast. It's always the same problems. Guys not priming, guys not wiping the way they should, machines not hanging straight, cows not being dipped. Most people don't like to confront problems, but you have to. To be honest, I really look forward to when I find good things happening in the barn and giving the men praise versus correcting them. It's actually quite refreshing. There are a few things that have been done in the barn, but those few steps cannot vary. Those few crucially important steps must be monotonous because cows love being boring. Cows are creatures of habit. They like the same thing every day, all day, for their entire lives. Any deviance in their routine, which includes how they are being prepped, will make all the difference. I can't say the employees vary from the routine because they're being malicious, but I do think they vary from the routine because they're human. Humans hate doing the same thing all the time. So I think it's normal for them to vary in the routine. But should they? No. But it's our job as managers and owners to be there constantly to remind them what they are doing, and why they are doing it. The why of how we milk cows is important. You just can't tell your workers to do something. That means nothing. That is an easy thing to do, but to be successful, you have to do the hard things like being on repeat with your encouragement and your corrections. We really focus on the why. We try to help them understand that this is for their own good and to make it easier for them, and it's good for the cows. We want them to understand the science behind the why of what they are doing and why they are doing it. We want them to care as we care. They have to buy into our why for all this to be successful. We have milking schools every quarter, and for sure more often if we see things starting to slip. Alongside the things I mentioned, we focus on beds, we focus on cows being fed every day at the exact same time. Every day within 3 minutes. So example, if like pen 1 is supposed to be fed by 4:30 a.m., the cows will be fed by 4:30 a.m. within 3 minutes. And this absolutely will not vary. This happens two times a day. We milk the cows every day, 2 times per day, within 3 minutes of the time they're supposed to be milked. Each pen is brought into the barn at the same time every day, 2 times a day, within 3 minutes of the time they are supposed to be in the barn. We push feed at the same time every day. The cows will be let go from the headlocks at the same time every day, all within 3 minutes as the day before. All these things happen within 3 minutes as the day before and the day before that. This goes for all the routines on the dairy. Now, do things sometimes slip? Of course. But then it goes back to perseverance. If you don't say something, things will just continue getting worse. You must speak up and correct the issue. Being on repeat can get very old. I mean, as all of us probably know, it's very old to just be constantly on repeat. But you must keep doing it. And doing all these things, every morning I input yesterday's information on an Excel worksheet that I made years ago. It tracks everything from components, somatic cell, bacteria, dry matter intake, weather changes that were made, etc. Literally anything you want to know on how the dairy performed was tracked. It's a near perfect snapshot of what happened. I have this information dating back to 2011. And every day I do this, not my managers, not my vets, not my nutritionists, me. I do it. You can't monitor what you don't monitor.
There are a billion gold nuggets in what you just shared, and I want to take a couple minutes to dig into a few of them. I want to start with what you just talked about with your method of tracking. And for one, that backs up something that you have reiterated already in our conversation about consistency, and consistently going into that same spreadsheet every day may be monotonous, but you are demonstrating consistency and how you're tracking that performance. And so as you talked about, it's a spreadsheet, right? A simple spreadsheet, but you've been doing this for years and years. So you have more than 10 years of data. And we're not just talking about the data that everybody else is collecting. We're talking about farm-specific, performance-related data.
So on my spreadsheet, like I said, besides everything I mentioned, what I track, I actually have like a note section on the side which tracks ration changes, whether the power went out, whatever that case may be. I have all that information always tracked. So actually, about 2 months ago, my somatic cell was trending up, and I linked it back to a change I made about 60 days prior to that. And I do contribute that to my spreadsheet because I was trying to figure out what the difference was, and I couldn't figure it out. I mean, the milkers are doing fine, right, minus a few miscellaneous things that we're always working on. The dairy seemed to be going fine, but I went back to this one change that we did, and I found it didn't work. So we reverted back to what was working. I mean, in the moment I thought it would work, but it didn't work.
Back to what you said before too, if you aren't measuring it, you can't truly monitor it. And people can say that loosely, but you really take that to heart. You also track milker performance, right?
We pay a bonus to all our milkers as far as how many mastitis cows they actually pull out of the milk barn. Like, so if they're milking pen 1 and there's a mastitis cow in there and Jesus pulled that cow out, I want to give him credit for pulling that cow out, right? Well, if Jesus and Pedro and Samuel are all doing these great jobs, But then you have Hector over here on the left side who's randomly not pulling any cows, but the quality of the milk is still good on the dairy. Well, who should be getting the credit? And so I track each guy on how many cows they're pulling as far as mastitis. And it's all on a spreadsheet. So at the end of the month, Jesus might have 10 cows, Hector might have 11 or whatever, right down the line. And so as long as they're all within the same realm, within 60% of each other, then I give them a bonus. But I have had it before in the past. Now they know how I work. But in the past, it would be like, well, we're all doing this great job, and then somebody would complain that, hey, so-and-so is not doing his job. Well, that was my fix to everybody being on alert for quality control.
So let's just take this piece right here as an example, this employee tracking measurement that you have, and then using that to also reward the good behaviors. How does that action fit into a bigger picture of your team and how they perform and how long they stick around and want to be a part of what you're doing?
Well, I think it makes a huge difference because so if somebody's doing a great job, they're not feeling like they're overworking somebody else but getting paid the same, right? So everybody is actually doing the same job because they don't want to let their teammates down, and their teammates will know that if they're not doing their job and they're not pulling the cows they're supposed to be doing or supposed to be pulling, everybody's going to know that because the spreadsheet is visible to everybody in the parlor, right? So they're all going to know who's not contributing to the team, and nobody wants to be the guy that's lacking on the team. I mean, if you do, then your heart's not in it, right? But most people want to do a good job, and most people actually are good, and most people do care about what they're doing. What I found, guys love being a part of that team where everybody's working together, not just somebody's doing one job or working harder than somebody else.
As you said, they enjoy being a part of a team where everybody's working together. But let's add a layer to that. Do you think that they also take pride in being part of let's call it a winning team? Going back to the premise of this conversation of being one of the producers of top quality milk at a level that's competitive with any dairy in the world, what does that mean to your employees?
In a larger dairy, it's harder, in my opinion, to get somatic cell under 100, right? But it can be done, and it's not necessarily like any more challenges. It's just harder to do, and then like a smaller dairy or whatever. But I do find that, like in our meetings when we always talk about the employees, I always tell them they're professionals. They're professionals in their arena, right? I mean, you have professionals that are lawyers, you have professionals that are accountants. I mean, bigwigs that are quote professionals, right? Well, these men and women are actually professionals in their arena. And so we encourage them to be that professional. And so when we do talk, I always say, like, you guys are the number one dairies in the nation. And I do think that that hits them in a way that's different than, them just working on some random dairy where, the milk quality is not that great, the atmosphere is not that great, and where everybody's not really playing on equal playing field. And so I do think they strive. When you tell somebody that they are number one, they're going to live up to that.
So that also reinforces something that you shared earlier as well about how you see your role. And you mentioned 3 keywords: to monitor, encourage, and instill. As you said, you are watching these things every single day, but go in a little more detail. What does monitoring look like for you?
That varies on a lot of different levels, and I think a lot of dairymen can relate to this. If you're in the barn, everybody should be in the barn, in my opinion. You should be going shoulder to shoulder with these guys and working with these guys and checking pulsators and checking machine, the gaskets on the machines and making sure that the men actually see you a part of the goal that we're all trying to reach, right? All those things should be implemented. But which we would probably all agree, the more that you're in the barn, like if you're in the barn, say if I'm in the barn, 4 or 5 hours a day, and it's a fine line, and I don't even really know how to word it, but they're going to do it so perfectly that it's actually going to make them slower than if you kind of step back, trust them that they're going to do it correctly. And that's a different subject, right? But you're going to trust them that they can do it correctly. And they actually know how to milk cows. Like I said, these guys are professionals. They know what they're doing. But if you're in there over their shoulder too much, I do think that kind of hinders them from being the professionals that they are. But I am watching them on the camera quite a bit. Like I am in the office watching them on the camera. If I see things going incorrectly, I see, water spraying on the cow's teats, or the guy's not priming correctly, or whatever that case may be, those things are addressed, right? But then there are also things that are going very well in the barn that are also praised. So it all kind of goes hand in hand.
Yeah, so it's monitoring without hovering, but you never truly take your eyes off of things. We've been talking about your milking professionals, the people that are experts at milking cows on your team. But to take a step back and look at the bigger picture of who makes up your milk quality team, who are the other key people that help your dairies to be able to achieve a 75,000 somatic cell count at your size and scale?
So my milk quality team is as follows. It's me, my managers, vets, nutritionists, and most importantly, the employees. They're the ones actually carrying out the tasks that we're asking to be done. My managers paid based off his performance with the employees and ensuring they are doing things correctly. Everyone in our system gets a base pay, but they can make more money doing things correctly. Obviously, that's called their bonus, but most people want more money. It's an obvious thought, but money does make things happen. The money only comes if they perform, though. I get paid a somatic cell bonus for being under 100, and I have no problem sharing that with the men and women making it happen. I actually sleep better knowing that they might care just a little bit more because of it. Me and my manager and employees are obviously there every day doing the things we do. My consulting team is a little bit different. My nutritionist comes once a month. When I hired this group about 4 or 5 years ago, I went from a consulting firm that came out weekly, but little did I know they saw what I saw, and that was very little. It's hard to see things changing when you are there too often. And I know this sounds really weird, but I'm only talking about my consultants and advisors. Management employees obviously need to be there every day. Watching milking routines needs to happen every day. Taking care of the beds, feeding cows, giving shots, all these things that make a dairy happen need to be executed every day. I'm only talking about my consultants. I find that when my nutritionist comes monthly versus weekly, she actually better picks up on changes occurring. She can better see if cows are getting too thin or too fat, or if the manure changes, or whatever the case may be. Because in her mind, she only has last month's snapshot compared to this month's. I feel it's easier to actually address issues quicker. My vets walk the pens every 2 weeks during vet check, and they're always checking for issues. As far as my processor, which I think every dairy should work with their processor closely, and I think most dairies do nowadays. I think it's different than it was 20 years ago or whatever. But they're very good about uploading information to the website so that I can track components, somatic cell, bacteria counts. I usually have information within 24 hours, and that also helps me see things changing for the better or for the worse. The faster we get information, the better it is for us, the processor, and most importantly, the consumer.
So you're taking in information not just from your own tracking system, but also with what your milk quality support team is able to provide to you.
Right. And then, also we take information in from the employees, things that they're seeing on the dairy. There's a lot of things that I would say, if you just take the time to listen to them, it actually really does make a difference in your program as a whole. Because a lot of times it's not like, hey, I want to milk, like right now we're priming cows 5 times. Well, okay, but they want to prime 3 times. Well, that's not logical. We're not going to do that. But there's other things that they bring up that are like, I've noticed that the beds are getting a little wet, or whatever the case may be. Well, those things that if you're too arrogant to not listen to it, then you're not improving. So listening to, like we were talking about, our professionals really can make a difference. You have to take everything with a grain of salt, but it can make a difference.
Okay, so you just talked about listening. And do most of your professionals that are milking, most of your milking team, do they speak English as a first language?
No,
And do you speak Spanish?
I can speak dairy Spanish. So I can't like talk to them about their trip to Disneyland because I don't know how to say Disneyland and how is your roller coaster ride in Spanish. But yeah.
And Google can take care of that part, right? But but dairy Spanish Google doesn't know. So I'm curious for you because I have this conversation. It's amazing how many incredible high performing managers I know that have overcome a language barrier, but really not by learning the language, but just through daily interactions and touch points and just finding other ways to communicate. So when it comes to being able to stand shoulder to shoulder with your team members and also have conversations, and I know you call it dairy span, but there's ways that you're learning to communicate with your team that, I'm sure over the years you've had to just find a way. So how have you been able to both listen, ask questions, listen, and also provide redirection when there is that language barrier? What's worked for you?
One thing I really pride myself on is that I will know everybody's name that works for me. So every morning, at least 2 or 3 times a week, I will go, like when I'm walking through the freestyle barns and I pass, Francisco or whatever, I do make an effort to call him out by his name because, everybody's name is the most beautiful sound in the world to them, right? So it's not necessarily the most beautiful thing. I don't love saying Francisco, but to Francisco loves hearing the name Francisco, right? That's what he loves it. So to call them by their name really sets a tone for the morning for these guys, right? Mm-hmm. And there's times when we're having conversation and he's like, somebody's laughing, like Manuel's laughing and telling a story. And honestly, I have no idea what he's saying, but he's laughing, so I'm laughing, and I can kind of get the gist of it. Maybe he's telling me a story about his son or whatever, right? But I don't know exactly what he's saying. But just standing there with a blank stare in your face doesn't do anybody any good. So you might as well engage with them in laughter. And if they're sharing something that you can tell is a little more serious, put a little more thought into that. You can tell by their face. You just got to read people. Look at their facial expressions. If they're not having a good conversation with you, and you can tell by their eyes and the way their facial expressions are, take a little deeper thought into that and try to understand. If you say you don't understand, then if I don't understand, then I ask my manager. I'm like, hey, Manuel has something that he's trying to tell me, and it seems like there's something that may be wrong or something that's more serious. Let's dig into this, right? But I don't need to get translation necessarily for just a fun conversation that we're all having, and he's smiling, I'm smiling, and then we all walk away, and he's happy I know his name, and we laughed, and then he's like, oh, the boss cares about me. So those are the things that you have to do on a daily, I feel like.
So as you explain that, Hans, it sounds like this has become second nature for you. But is this something you've always been naturally good at, or did you have to learn as you've grown into your role?
No, I had to learn. I used to have some problems like dealing with people. I felt like every way or all the ways should be only my way. It was my way or the highway. It was literally how I used to operate. And I used to fire guys for not waving at me. I was crazy. Like something was wrong with me in the head, right? But then I read this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I actually listen to that book every August. And I have a quote later on from that book that I actually try to live by. So I read that book, and it was really because I was having turnover at that time. And honestly, some of those guys, I look back now and I'm like, I kind of wish I had some of those guys back that I fired, right? But you can't change history, but you can change the future. So I was trying to learn how to be a better manager. And there's several books I read, from Good to Great, How to Win Friends and Influence People. But it really changed how I viewed my men and women that worked for me. They worked for me, but they are my coworkers at the same time.
Yeah, so those are the game changers for you that led you to become the manager you are today.
Right.
What I've learned from personal experience is usually I don't change until something really forces me to change. So
Yep. No, it's true. You have to. With the economy that was that was doing so well with that. Like especially in Idaho here, we have the housing boom going on out here, and dairies compete with construction for the most part as far as labor. Well, I'm only about 10, 15 minutes from like the major cities here in Idaho, like Napa, Meridian, Boise, that whole metropolitan area. And so at the time we were losing guys. Well, it's either just keep paying more, which is not always the answer, right? Even though everybody should deserve a livable wage. But at the same time, it's either me adjust or they're going to adjust. And they're not going to adjust because they're just going to say, well, the hell with this. I'm going to go down the street to the construction. So I only had one option, and that was for me to change.
So it's interesting because you've done the hard work, the hard part of change. And some days you're like, man, it'd be easier if I could just write a check, just pay them more, right? Rather than change. Some days. But I think that also plays into what you shared earlier too, about how you reward managers based on their performance, and how part of your belief in your structure is to reward people for their performance.
Right. And it's not just the managers, it's actually everybody on the dairy gets a bonus. Like all of our employees will get a bonus based off their performance. So the milkers, the maternity guys, the feeding guys. I mean, if the feeding guys are within 2% on deviance on their ingredients, maternity guys on death loss. I mean, everybody gets a bonus. So, which is kind of fun because they get to create, in a way, their own salary, right? Like, okay, we're doing great here, and we have tiers, right? If you're under 100,000 somatic cell, it's a $400 bonus, and then under 80, it's a $500 bonus, and then under 600 is like I think we're at 750 right now. But these guys can create their own money for the month if they want, right? To an extent. So, yeah, it's everybody, not just the managers.
So when did you adopt that philosophy into that performance-based pay system?
When I came back to dairy in 2007, my dad had a somatic cell bonus for the milkers only. If they're under 200,000 at the time, they would get a $300 bonus. Well, I saw kind of where the industry was going and where our cows were going. And so I took away the 200,000 somatic cell bonus, and I said, I'll give you, if you get under 100 at the time, I said, if you give it 100, I'll give you $500. And it really pushed the guys to work on the performance, right? Well, once we got there and we got comfortably under that, like 75, 80, which it wasn't like that. I mean, it took time to get under 100. But once we finally got into a comfortable level under 100, then I changed how we paid the guys. So it went from, like I just explained earlier, under 100, under 80, under 60. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And it's worked.
Yeah, it's worked. Yeah.
Yeah. And as you said, it's not just, I mean, we've been focusing on the milk quality piece, but as you said, this is something you do across the dairy. And does this go back to your spreadsheets where you're tracking a lot of this data and being able to reference that when it comes to who gets those performance bonuses?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, 6 or 7 months ago, we had our somatic cell went up to like 75. So under 60, they get an extra bonus, right? The milkers. But I found that based on other things that were going on the dairy, it wasn't necessarily the milkers' fault of why we were over 60. So if I just kept everything like this, without knowing what was going on, then the milkers would have been deducted their bonus, even though it really wasn't their fault. We had other issues that we were dealing with. And so those issues had to be addressed, but there's no reason to punish the men that are actually doing a great job. You know, that's why that goes back to the whole spreadsheet from the milkers, right? Everybody's got to do their job. And if one person's letting the team down, doesn't mean that everybody should be punished for that job.
I love hearing about the employee side and how you're managing people. What are some of the important animal health and care practices provided for your cows that also help contribute to the production of high quality milk?
I would say everything you do on a dairy contributes to milk quality. There's not just one thing. All things go hand in hand. I always say no one's job is more important than another, but without diligent management, it all falls apart. It must flow kind of like an orchestra, everyone in unison. from how the cows are handled to where the cows lay down. Again, cows love consistency. They love being fed at the same time every day and love being milked at the same time every day. They love being handled in a calm manner, and they love being prepped the same way every day. Whether you are 2 times or 3 times a day, it must be consistent. If one guy is prepping differently, then that one individual is not helping the cause. If you have a group of men or women, whether that's 2, 4, 6, 8 people, or whatever it is, milking, you need to make sure they're in unison. They need to be working as one unit, like a copy machine, to produce the same product day in and day out. To copy that product to perfection every day is the hardest challenge there is on dairies. Getting the guys to buy into your way of doing things is extremely hard. Everyone has different personalities, and getting those different personalities to hit the same note is very difficult. Other issues that are hard but slightly easier to execute is the feed and cow housing. The feed needs to be the same every day with little changes as possible. The beds need to be dry and fluffy for the cows to lay down in. The cow handling needs to be calm and quiet. Again, this all falls back on us as owners and managers to make sure these things happen. We must speak up when we see things not going as planned. On the other hand, we must give praise and appreciation when we see things going correctly. People live up to what they are being told. So if they are doing a good job, praise them, pay them, because naturally a person wants to live up to what others think of them. That is our job as owners and managers. We are glorified cheerleaders. We need to be consistent for the employees to be consistent. If we are inconsistent, then guess what? The employees will be inconsistent.
Yeah. So consistency, and it's easy to talk about when we talk about milk quality, consistency of routine and consistency of providing that environment for the cows. And as you've talked about, consistency of within 3 minutes for feed delivery and everything else. But really, consistency is a top-down management thing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And it's hard. I mean, as I think all dairymen and managers can relate, there's days that it's just hard. But that's where the cheerleader aspect comes in. You have to go out. You can have the worst day at home. Maybe your kids aren't listening. Maybe there's something else going on, right? But you better show up to work, in my opinion, with a smile on your face, letting everybody know that, hey, everything's going to be okay here. We're all on the same page. Because if you take home or you take to work, and vice versa, actually, if you take your work problems home, you're going to have problems, right? And if you take your home problems or your other personal problems to the dairy, you're going to have problems. So everything kind of goes in hand. You need to keep that separately. And that's hard to do. I mean, consistently, that's really hard to do.
And, we talk about consistency in management, but with what you just shared, Hans, I think we could sub out the word management and call it what it really is, leadership.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with you.
Because ultimately, depending on how you want to define management, kind of the old school definition was being the person that essentially told others, hey, this is where you need to be, this is what you need to do. But what you're talking about is true leadership, and that's self-awareness of how you show up each day. That's holding yourself to a higher standard within that and doing it every single day.
And I think that's why a lot of people that work in, just outside of dairies in general, like people that work in offices or cubicles or whatever, they really don't like their bosses, because that's really what they are bosses, right? Where I do think that being a teacher and teaching others to strive to be the best is what kind of brings out the best in people. I do think that if I just go out there and, hey, Hector, you need to clean this pen. Okay, I'll clean it, but why am I doing it? Like teaching them, because then maybe he'll go out there and be like, oh, this pen's dirtier than it needs to be. I'm going to go take initiative and do this myself. And those are the type of things that we try to teach our employees. Now, it's obviously clearly not perfect, but that is what we're striving for.
And that goes back to consistency of daily conversation too, right?
Right. Correct. Yep.
So when we first began talking about some of these practices on the animal side, you gave the analogy of an orchestra and having everything just flow together, make this, beautiful musical, so to speak. When we were at NMC, you had talked a little bit about the actual routine in the parlor. Do you want to just take a moment and explain what that milking routine looks like?
We used to milk in a train, which they call a train, where like one guy would be pre-dipping, and then right behind him would be two guys priming, like this is in the double 50, and then two guys priming, and then right behind him would be one guy wiping, and then right behind him would be two guys attaching, and then on the other side would just be some guy post-dipping cows, right? Well, there was no flow. Like everybody was just following each other. There's no stimulation time for the cows. So it was actually recommended to me, which I met the guy, funny, at the MNC, and I don't remember his name now, but he's the one who actually recommended it to me, to milk in sections. And so now in our double 50, each guy has 7 cows that they take care of. And then the last guy has 8 cows that he takes care of. Actually, vice versa. 8 cows on the first and 7 for the rest. But anyways, regardless. So each guy now is, we still have one guy pre-dipping. And then we have one guy in his section. He's doing all the priming in his section now, right? So he'll prime each cow 5 times, and we make sure that they prime each teat 5 times. And cows have 4 teeth, and sometimes they have to be reminded of that. But they got to prime 4 teats 5 times, and then that's going down one way, and then coming back, they'd wipe the cows, but in a circular motion. Instead of just pulling straight down, they wipe in a circular motion, and then making sure they clean the teat end, because that's where a lot of the bacteria harbors out. And then going back the opposite direction, they start attaching machines, and we make sure that they're hanging them straight, so that they're hanging, like sometimes if the machine is too far forward, right, the back teats will milk out too fast, and if the front teats or if it's too far back, the front teats will milk out too fast. So we really try to make sure that it's hanging straight, and then making sure they're checking for squawking. And then once that procedure is done, then they flip over to the other side, and then they can start post-dipping those cows, and then the whole procedure starts over again. But the crucial thing that we found, man, I really wish I could remember that guy's name, but was priming 5 times. Priming 5 times really made a huge difference in what we were doing. And I remember when he recommended that to me, he's like, yeah, it's up to you. You know, I know it works, but, you know, you just got to make sure it works. Well, I was young at that time. In 2009, I was only, was that 14 years ago? I was like 23 or something like that. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah. But I was a little arrogant, so I was like, no, I'm going to make it work. I'm going to make it work. But little did I know now, looking back on that it was just keeping that implementation process, but keeping it going. Because you can start something, but as long as if you don't keep it going, then you're going to have, I mean, it doesn't really matter, right? It can implement the greatest thing in the world, but if it's not being followed through, it doesn't really matter.
And so that's a system that you've adopted.
Right. And I mean, a lot of people probably have great ways of milking, and a lot of strategies work. I mean, they don't not work, right? It's just this is one that works for me, and because I keep it going. And other people keep other strategies going, but they keep on top of it, and that's why it works for them. So I think it really comes down to, yeah, the strategy is great, and there's a lot of great ideas out there, but just really keeping that strategy going and keeping it consistent.
That word once again, consistency. Okay, so we've talked a lot about different ways that you are implementing into your management style and managing of people and even managing of the operations in the barn to be able to achieve milk quality. But one thing we haven't talked about is technology. Is there any technology that you've implemented or are considering implementing to continue to maintain milk quality at the level you're at, capture even more improvement, which would be maybe minimal compared to how far you've come, or even to, say, replace a job or a task that a human is doing? What's your picture and your view on implementing technology into your dairies?
Yeah, so there's no new technologies that I'm using on the dairies. Actually, right now, I mean, there's double off-sync programs and all, but a lot of these things have been around for a long time, right? I mean, I guess in the end, what I'm trying to mimic is human robots, but I'm not naive. I understand we are humans, and humans are not perfect. So until the day comes when we have robots that actually work well in parallel barns, because I have all parallel barns, so it'd have to be for a parallel barn, right? And all the bugs have been worked out of them, then we will have a new type of person that we have to manage, right? That making sure they're doing their job correctly. And that will be the engineer or the maintenance crew, making sure the robots are working correctly. In the end, we're always going to be working with people, whether that's people, milking or people taking care of robots, feeders, guys giving shots, bankers, milk processors, etc. We can have all the technology and information at our disposal, but the successful dairies, and for that matter, any business, needs to be able to handle people. And doing that correctly and effectively is and always will be hard. I want to quote something from a book, kind of what I mentioned earlier, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's something I try to live by when it comes to my employees. And remember, this was written in 1921, or this was taking place in 1921. And it's, quote, "Why did Andrew Carnegie pay $1 million a year, or more than $3,000 per day, to Charles Schwab? Why? Because Charles Schwab was a genius? No. Because he knew more about the manufacture of steel than other people? Nonsense. Charles Schwab said himself that he had many men working for him who knew more about the manufacture of steel than he did. Schwab says he was paid this salary largely because of his ability to deal with people. I asked him how he did it. Here is his secret set down in his own words. I consider my ability to arouse enthusiasm among my people, said Schwab. The greatest asset I possess, and the way to develop the best that is in a person is by appreciation and encouragement. There is nothing else that so kills the ambitions of a person as criticism from superiors. I never criticize anyone. I believe in giving a person incentive to work. So I am anxious to praise, but loath to find fault. If I like anything, I am hearty in my approbation and lavish in my praise." Unquote. I do think this is true, and a rule I try to follow. Technology is great, and technology is coming and advancing every day. But behind the scenes, we will always be dealing with people in one way or another. That is the nature of business. People are always going to be the number one most crucial aspect of milk quality. All tips and tricks of the trade are great. Most ideas work and the reasons behind them make sense. But if you cannot get your people to execute and care as you do, which is crucial, they have to care as you do, it will be in vain. It will be in vain regardless of technology.
So there wasn't one thing that you said, Hans, about an incredible game-changing technology, a revolutionary treatment, a magical tube for mastitis.
Right.
It all comes back to people.
Yeah, it's all people in the end. Yeah. I mean, there's technology out there that's going to help, right? There's a lot of tools that are great, but you can have the greatest technology, but if your people just decide not to show up anymore, well, then where are you?
So bigger picture, when you look at the challenges that you have already overcome or the ones that you foresee in the future to be able to continue to produce the volume and the quality of milk that you're doing, what do you see?
I think one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in the future is going to be, and it's a double-edged sword, right? But it's kind of technology, because like I see it already on the dairy. Like there's guys on their cell phones at times when they shouldn't be, right? And so they're not focused on their job because they're on Facebook or Instagram or wherever that case may be. And so I do think keeping people engaged, right? Everybody gets these dopamine hits now from technology, and so to go to work isn't necessarily the greatest dopamine hit that you can get nowadays, right? I mean, you can just scroll on Instagram and Facebook and be completely content with what's going on around, or actually be oblivious to what's going on around you. So I think keeping people engaged in any business is going to be probably the hardest challenge there is in the future. I think just not dairy alone, but in any business.
How are you going to position yourself to overcome that challenge or that opportunity to be able to engage people differently?
That's a great question. And I don't really know the answer to that yet. I've actually been thinking about this significantly lately, and I don't know if I really have the answer for that yet. So maybe one day in the future I'll have an answer.
And then you're going to call me and we're going to do a podcast on that, right?
Yeah. If I come up with an answer, that'd be great.
So one of the things that you also talked about from the very beginning of our conversation, Hans, was about the reinforcement of making sure that your team members know the why. for what they're
Hmm.
doing, the why behind it. And so when we were in Dallas for National Mastitis Council, I actually got the chance to present to the group on the Start With Why by Simon Sinek. Take a step back, look at everything that you're doing personally, professionally, in the business, in your own home. How do you define your why?
So I went to Africa like in 2007. I was there for 6 weeks, and I was in Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and all that. And there were starving people everywhere. Just it was kind of sad. And so when I got back to the U.S., weirdly enough, we went out to a restaurant, and there was people that had, people don't finish their food, right? Some people take it home, some people don't take it home. Well, there was a table next to me that had, and I think, how old was I, 17 or something? There's a table next to me, and they ended up not wanting all their food. And then I looked back into the kitchen because we were kind of positioned towards the kitchen, and they just dumped all this food into the trash, right? So, and it kind of hit me just coming back after that trip of what we do here in America and how much we discard. So being in the food industry, essentially, I mean, we make food, right? I think what we do to give people the best quality food that we can is something that I strive to do. So that's kind of why I do it. Is I like feeding people, and I like that a lot of product gets shipped overseas. Now, I don't know how that's necessarily all handled, right? If it's handled correctly or not correctly, but that's why I do it. And then the second reason I do it is because, like they say, by the third generation, most family businesses have dissolved, right? And so I am the third generation. And so I have a burden, I guess, if you want to call it, on my shoulders, but in a good way. It's not like a burden where like I feel obligated, I have to do this, but it's a good burden where I want to kind of be the outlier in that statistic to allow my kids the opportunity to dairy and to feed the future generations. I mean, I think with the water situations that are going out here in the West, I mean, Idaho is pretty good for water, but I do think like in Arizona and the Okalaga Reservoir, I mean, all these things where there's a potential for reduction in food in the future with population growth, I do think there's a lot of pride to have in what we're doing. And doing that and passing it on to the next generation is fun. I mean, my kids go to work with me every weekend. They love it. They're older now. They used to go with me every day, but they're in school now. But they love being out there and with the guys and giving shots and scraping corrals, and like it's just fun. It's a great place to raise kids. I mean, I'd rather do this any day. I mean, looking out at my window right now, and we got the mountains with snow on it out there and green triticale field right here. But it's great. Like, you can't have that in town, in my opinion. You sit there in town, and I mean, I used to live in town, and it's boring. Like, there's nothing there. This is a great opportunity for kids, and that's why I take pride in it.
So your why for doing what you do, I mean, if we look at what you're doing to produce high quality milk, it really goes back to a bigger picture, for one, of being able to have experienced seeing people that didn't have access and opportunity to even have a quality or quantity of food. But then there's a whole nother why, and that's being able to provide opportunity within your own home for your own children to enjoy not just a business, but a life and a way of life that is bigger and has more opportunities within it. You just heard from Hans Nederend from Nederend Dairies in Marsing, Idaho. And when it comes to producing the highest quality milk from his dairies, Hans so simply breaks it down to these key factors. Number 1, be consistent and persistent. Do the boring things, even when it's hard. Spend time in the parlor, track performance, look for trends, and keep cows consistent. For him, that's tracking a 3-minute deviation on each major move of the dairy, milking, headlocks, moving cows to and from the parlor. Number 2, self-awareness. Hans does the work, and he keeps doing it. Each year, he listens to Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Being cognizant of how he addresses his team and communicates with them is also how that leads to number 3, professionalizing his milking team. They are his milking professionals, and he addresses them as such, and he rewards his team based on their performance and contributions to excellent milk quality. And it all wraps up into his inner drive, a powerful why for producing high-quality milk and a high-quality life for himself, his family, and his team. And if you enjoyed listening to Hans, make sure you tune in to our next episode, part 2, to hear more from Hans. This episode is sponsored by Uplevel Dairy Podcast founding partner Idaho, a global leader in nutritional solutions and premier provider of rumen-protected methionine for dairy producers who want to optimize milk production, capture more value from components, and maintain the health of their high-performing herds. Feed is the greatest expense on any dairy operation, and don't you want to know how an adjustment to the ration will affect your bottom line? Adiseo empowers nutritionists to make informed ration balancing decisions with MilkPay.com. Customizable to your dairy's own data, this profitability calculator puts the power of real-time milk market information right in the palm of your hand. Find out how much your latest ration change is really costing you with the free MilkPay app, available on iOS and through MilkPay.com.